A reading from Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 through 11. Ask and it will be given to you. Search and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds. And for everyone who knocks, the door will be opened. Is there anyone among you who, if your child asked for bread, would give a stone? Or if the child asked for a fish, would give a snake? If you, then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will God in heaven give good things to those who ask?
We begin a new sermon series today, Dispatches from Cell 92, inspired by the thought of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the 20th century German pastor and theologian whose writings over the decades have inspired Christians to think deeply about the relationship between personal faith and social responsibility. Bonhoeffer lived through extraordinary, unspeakable times. He became a pastor as Hitler was rising to power. Churches were slowly being co-opted by the Nazis. Christianity was rapidly succumbing to secularism. The Holocaust had already begun with the construction of the first concentration camp at Dachau, and German Christians were astonishingly silent. It was this historic crucible that shaped Bonhoeffer's theology, especially his central belief that following Christ in a secular world requires a commitment of the whole self, all of who we are, the whole of our lives. This is hard for American Christians in the 21st century to grasp. Rarely do we give our whole selves to something. If we give ourselves to anything, we do so usually reservedly and mildly, guardedly. We don't usually sell out completely to anything. Everything in moderation, people will say, even in faith. But Bonhoeffer, as he witnessed the gradual collapse of his world and the silent complicity of his fellow Christians, argued that following Christ requires hard decisions and clear departures, fixed commitments and willing sacrifices, even suffering for others. This is the difference between true discipleship and simply being religious. Maybe it sounds heavy and somber and severe, but Bonhoeffer witnessed too many religious people turn their faces from genuine evil and human suffering. And what makes Bonhoeffer so compelling is that he said that as difficult and as costly as true discipleship may be, it ultimately leads to a life of freedom and joy. Given the price he paid for following Christ, perhaps this quote sums up his thought and his life most beautifully. He said, "If we answer the call to discipleship, where will it lead us? What decisions and partings will it demand? Only Jesus Christ, who bids us follow him, knows the journey's end. But we do know that it will be a road of boundless mercy. Discipleship," he said, "means joy." Over the next several weeks, we'll hear that word discipleship a lot as we explore Bonhoeffer's classic work, The Cost of Discipleship, a book that has had a profound impact on so many over the decades. If you're unfamiliar with Bonhoeffer, maybe you have been introduced to him through the recent biopic bearing his name, which portrays a somewhat different Bonhoeffer, a heroic, clear-eyed moral agent and activist who unmistakably distinguished good from evil in the world, and who, for the sake of ending the greater evil of Nazism, unquestioningly justified the lesser evil of joining a conspiracy to assassinate Hitler. His role in that assassination plot led to his arrest and execution at the age of 39, just days before the camps were liberated by Allied forces. But the Bonhoeffer film fails ultimately to portray the real Bonhoeffer, who never regarded himself as a hero or an activist. Like most of his contemporaries, Bonhoeffer felt a profound sense of moral failure in the fates of the Nazi regime and was haunted by inescapable guilt over the evils he felt powerless to stop. He identified himself along with his fellow Germans who ultimately failed to answer the call to discipleship and to resist Hitler early enough. In 1942, Bonhoeffer wrote a Christmas letter in which he reflected on the compromises and complicity of Germans during that first decade under Nazism. He wrote, "Have there ever been people in history who in their time like us had so little ground under their feet, people to whom every possible alternative open to them at that time appeared equally unbearable and senseless and contrary to life?" History and Hollywood like to turn Bonhoeffer into a larger-than-life hero. But the truth is, Bonhoeffer, as a pacifist, was deeply conflicted in the face of the Nazi regime. He never believed that the plot to assassinate Hitler was ever morally justified. While it's unclear how he was even involved in that plot, he insisted that while it was necessary, it was at the same time a grave moral wrong for which he must repent and beg God's forgiveness. And it's this paradox that makes a sermon series on Bonhoeffer so relevant for these times that we're living in. Like him, we all live with this tension between trying to follow Christ and trying to live in the real world with all its darkness and brokenness. How we are to respond faithfully to the real problems of this world is not always as clear and obvious as Hollywood makes it out to be. Bonhoeffer knew this, but so many of us today have forgotten this. We'd like to believe that the defeat of evil is marked by a straight moral path, that there are degrees of wrong, some of which are morally justified on our way to achieving ends that we are certain must be right. And that's rarely true. In recent years in the U.S., those on the right and on the left of the political aisle, evangelicals and progressives, have both laid claim to Bonhoeffer's legacy for very different and competing reasons, each pointing to his willingness to do what was morally questionable to prevent a greater evil as justification for their own questionable actions. Many who claimed that the 2020 election was stolen described the January 6th insurrection as a Bonhoeffer moment. Many in the aftermath of the 2024 election have wondered if a Bonhoeffer moment might be imminent. But Bonhoeffer would refuse to be anyone's political mascot. His life and contribution added up to more than a moment. And that's the Bonhoeffer I want to speak to us today. If Bonhoeffer could write to us today and speak into our own historical context, what would he tell us about the cost of discipleship, that is, apprenticeship under Jesus? What does it mean to follow Christ in our time and place? Bonhoeffer wrote The Cost of Discipleship at the age of 31. At that time, he was leading an underground seminary for a small resistance movement of pastors called the Confessing Church, a movement which opposed Hitler's efforts to unify all Protestant churches into a single pro-Nazi German church. The Confessing Church had just written a daring manifesto, if you will, called the Barmen Declaration, which asserted that the church was not an organ of the state, and that state control over the church was a heresy. This document boldly claimed that Christ, not the Führer, was the true head of the church, and it called upon all German ministers to follow a path of resistance. At that time, throughout Germany, you could find banners with swastikas hanging from altars in about 80% of Protestant churches. Most churches had capitulated to the Nazi regime. Many were already collaborating with its systematic program of eliminating the Jews in Europe. Bonhoeffer wrote The Cost of Discipleship in response to this historical moment. German Christians were selling out to what we would today describe as unbridled Christian nationalism. Christianity was eroding, dissolving into something unrecognizable. Christians and churches still looked religious. They just didn't look anything like Christ. And so Bonhoeffer wrote this famous book, and he began with a word about what he perceived to be the greatest enemy of the church, what he called cheap grace. Grace is a word Christians use a lot, but do not always know quite how to define. In a nutshell, grace is the check paid in advance. Grace describes the free, unmerited, unconditional love of God that is given to us out of God's own goodness before we even ask for it. It's the undeserved favor of God that meets us where we are, but does not leave us where it finds us. Grace describes God's very nature, God's deep and endless hunger that longs to give us what we need. And God's grace is always free, but Bonhoeffer said it never comes cheaply. And yet the church, he said, draped in swastikas, was giving grace away at cut prices, handing out consolations and blessings without asking hard questions, and preaching forgiveness without calling for repentance, granting absolution without asking for confession. And by doing so, the sin of Nazism, the idolatry of bowing to Hitler, the horrors of the Holocaust, so many sins were excused and condoned. Cheap grace. If it helps, consider those relationships that you would describe as loving. And imagine for a moment a scenario in which there was no expectation of accountability, humility, sacrifice, honesty, or mutuality on the part of the other in that relationship, especially when that other fell short or hurt you. And out of the goodness of your heart, you just kept giving and forgiving, while the other just keeps taking and mistaking, with no mutual expectation that things will ever change, until what you thought was love begins to feel degraded and dishonored, cheapened. Cheap grace. You've heard the phrase, why buy the cow when you can have the milk for free? That's cheap grace. As more and more German Christians were capitulating and compromising in the face of genuine evil, Bonhoeffer said, it was as if the church was saying, let the Christian live like the rest of the world. Let him model himself on the world's standards in every sphere of life and not aspire to live a different life under grace. Bonhoeffer's critique is no less true today. It's a different world, and yet we tend to downplay and mitigate the consequences of our errant ways, our moral compromises, our patterns of brokenness, our habits of destructiveness, our social evils and injustices. It can be easier to ask for forgiveness than to actually change our ways. when we whitewash the consequences of sin to get right to the good news of God's grace, we will always come back to church every week seeking forgiveness for the same familiar patterns, but with no humility, no accountability, no acknowledgement of our deep need for change, and thus no possibility for real transformation. We don't need to moralize or spiritualize this propensity toward cheap grace to know its power. There was a time in my life, in my late 20s, when I was a young pastor of a new church. I had no training at all on how to actually grow a new church, no clue at all what I was doing. I was working long hours because I was trying so hard to make this thing work, so afraid of failure. I didn't know it, but I was stressed out and I was exhausted. I was literally sick to my stomach. I went to the doctor who ran some tests and sent me to a specialist who ran some more tests. Then he sent me back to my doctor who said, "Are you experiencing any unusual stress in your life?" I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "Well, your condition, it's related to stress. And you need to make some changes in your life if you want to get well." He said, "How much coffee are you drinking every day?" I said, "You mean cups or pots?" And that was my first clue. Something had to change. Something a pill couldn't solve. I had to change. Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Search and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds. And for everyone who knocks, the door will be opened." I love this promise of Jesus. When it comes to the grace of God, all that's required of us is to ask and search and knock. Ask, search, knock. This is the cost of grace. It's the only cost of grace. And it's the answer to cheap grace. Ask, search, knock. We ask because God's grace can always be found in the heart of every question. And we seek because God's grace is found not just in the destination, but on the journey itself. And we knock because we know that on the other side of every door we encounter in life is a God of possibility, waiting to show us a new room. The work of asking and searching and knocking defines in a nutshell the work of the Christian life, the act of pursuing the grace of God. If grace is the favor of God that meets us where we are but does not leave us where it finds us, then costly grace is our work of pursuing where it is God desires for us to be. Bonhoeffer defines costly grace as the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will gladly go and sell all that he has. It is the pearl of great price to buy, which the merchant will sell all his goods. It is the call of Jesus Christ, he says, at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. Imagine if we conceived of Christianity as a way of life that was centered around asking, searching, knocking for what God longs to give us, instead of guilting and shaming and fear-mongering over what God threatens to do to us. Imagine if we understood that Christianity isn't about securing one's place in heaven or earning God's grace on earth or avoiding God's wrath in hell, but about a vision of something so beautiful that those with eyes to see it are drawn in to a way of life and behaviors and attitudes that support that vision, giving over their whole selves completely in order to pursue it, in order to surrender to it. This act of seeking and surrender is the costly grace Bonhoeffer spoke of, and the grace that he observed was so absent in his time. And his call to discipleship was an invitation to the people of his time and to us to ask what it was that God was longing to give them. If Christ was truly leading them, what would the church and the people and his country look like? And then to give them their whole selves, to give their whole selves to following Christ in pursuit of that vision. His question is as relevant today as it was back then. What are we asking for, searching for, knocking for? What vision is so beautiful that we are drawn to it in a way of life, behaviors and attitudes that will support it? And how are we willing to give our whole selves in pursuit of it? Years ago, a man named Anthony Cologne learned that his older brother Wilfredo had been shot to death on the streets of East Harlem. They were both just teenagers. Anthony described his brother as the only family he had, the one who looked out for him, who always saw the goodness in him. Afterwards, Anthony became angry, overcome with hatred. He said his brother's murder just put so much hate in his life. He said, I hated everybody. I hated everything. It made me into a monster. This anger took over his life for years, but eventually something changed. Anthony began attending church. He had a family, 2 kids. He was suddenly driven by this desire to find reconciliation with his brother's killer. And one day, while he was visiting someone else at a prison, he had this chance encounter with his brother's killer, a man named Michael Rowe. Rowe, in that encounter, saw Anthony and tried to duck down, expecting some type of physical, violent altercation. Rowe felt remorse and shame, unable to forgive himself for murdering another young man, afraid of retaliation. Anthony walked straight up to Rowe and said, Brother, I've been praying for you. I forgave you. I've been praying I would see you again. That chance encounter would change both men's lives. It lifted the cloud of shame that Rowe had lived with and gave him a second chance with the blessing of his victim's brother. Rowe eventually was paroled thanks to Anthony's support. Both men were released of the hurt and the anger. Transformation followed. And later Anthony said, people think it's strange, but it's just part of the nature of a person that's closely connected to God. There's a connection with God that can allow you to see past what's in front of you. It's what costly grace looks like, an outcome that cheap grace cannot achieve. A vision so beautiful that one is drawn into behaviors that support it. And people are giving their whole selves completely in pursuit of it. And so it is like what Bonhoeffer said. If we answer the call to discipleship, where will it lead us? What decisions and partings will it demand? Only Jesus Christ, who bids us follow him, knows the journey's end. But we do know that it will be a road of boundless mercy. Discipleship means joy. Our takeaways for today: grace is the favor of God that meets us where we are. Cheap grace always leaves us in our darkness. And costly grace is the road of mercy that leads us to joy.